A very good evening, everyone. Welcome to Lecture 10 of Professor H.D. Sankalia monthly lecture series on Jain heritage. Today, to deliver a talk on the topic Monastic Jurisprudence and Social History in Medieval Digambara Jainism, we have with us Mr. Kshitij Jain. But before we introduce him, for those who are joining in for the first time, let me brief you about Bhagwan Sheetalnath Chair for Jain Archaeology. Bhagwan Sheetalnath Chair for Jain Archaeology was established in the Department of AIC in Archaeology, Deccan College, 2 years back, and it was aimed at disseminating awareness on Jain heritages, Jain art and architecture and archaeology. It is funded by International School for Jain Studies and Vardhaman Charitable Foundation, USA. This particular chair started this series in the name of Professor S.D. Sankalia, the founder of the Department of Archaeology at Deccan College, to pay tributes to his academic career. He, with his article on Pali caves, pushed back the antiquity of Jainism in the region of Western Deccan to at least 2nd century BCE. Apart from this, he has had many excavations and many academic works to his credit, which is why the series was named after him. The chair runs a certificate course in Jain art and archaeology, organizes national level seminars, workshops, quiz competitions. Certain projects are also going on. And overall, all of these efforts are directed towards establishing Jain art and archaeology as a distinct field of study. We have with us Kshitij Jain, who has completed his post-graduation at the University of Oxford, pursuing his degree in classical Indian religion. He pursued his undergraduate in Sanskrit Honours at St. Stephen's College, University of Delhi. His major research interests include Digambara monasticism, Sanskrit and Prakrit narratives, and Dharmashastra literature. We are very happy to have you here, Kshitij. I kindly request you now to begin your lecture.
Thank you very much, Ocean, and thank you very much, Bhagwan Sheetalnath Chair in Jain Archaeology, for inviting me for this lecture. This is a working paper of my ongoing research, so it will be very brief, but I hope I am able to make some meaningful points in my presentation. If you can give me the permission to share my screen, I will start sharing.
Yes, you can share it now.
All right, just a minute. Yes, so as I mentioned, my research is on Digambara monastic laws, especially the monastic law books composed in medieval Digambara Jainism from 11th to 15th century C, that is early medieval and medieval times. I try to study these monastic law books as a source of social history of medieval Digambara communities to see how these law books are indicating expansion of communities, formation of lineages, emergence of new practices, reinterpretation of the old ones. So these are some of the primary research questions that I am looking at right now in my PhD. Uh, as far as it is about the importance of monastic literature in Jainism, I do not need to say much about it. Monastic literature has been present in the Jain canon from the very beginning, and it is also because of the presence of us of an organized monastic group ever since the time of at least Parshanatha, which we find textual evidences for. Within this monastic literature, the position of Digambara monastic literature becomes precarious because, as we know, Digambaras reject the Shvetambara canon and consider it to be inauthentic. And therefore, in this process, they also end up rejecting the monastic literature which is preserved in the canon by Shvetambaras today. They have their own literary genre called Chanana Yoga, which deals with conduct and ethics, and within this Kachanana Yoga, we find treatises on monastic law books, starting with the Mulachara of Vattakera, composed somewhere around 2nd century C, and the Bhagavati Aradhana of Shivarya, which is also contemporary to Mulachara, although we do not know the exact time period of their composition. The focus of my dissertation or my PhD research is on the medieval Digambara monastic law books, which were composed between 11th to 15th century C. Now, in my presentation or in my broad research, I try to deal with questions including why do we need to study these monastic law books in the first place? Like what is their significance as sources of quote unquote social history that I mentioned? And then I try to look at the historical processes and changing historical context in the Digambara communities which are represented by these monastic law books. My method is to first look at the textual structure of each monastic law book and to take case studies from each of them to understand two things: that A, how are they describing or prescribing certain monastic practices, and B, how are they engaging with the earlier monastic law books? Because my central argument is that these monastic law books are not just prescribing monastic conduct, they are also reinterpreting the monastic prescriptions or the preceptives of earlier law books like the Mulachara. So how both of these processes are happening simultaneously is something I aim to look at. Uh, and the final byline would be that my research looks at how the medieval monastic law books were products of socio-political and cultural processes happening in medieval India that shaped Digambara Jainism. So, although it is, it might be not very relevant, but yeah, the Mulachara is the first law, the earliest law book available in the Digambara tradition, which was composed in Prakrit. The identity of the author Vattakira is unknown. There are speculations, but we are not certain. We can safely assume that it was composed somewhere around 2nd, 3rd century CE. And the more important part for us is the reception of the Mulachara or its circulation in medieval Digambar tradition. There are two available commentaries: the Achara Vritti of Vasunandi Siddhant Chakravarti, Sanskrit, 11th century CE, and the Muridan Chintamani of Meghachandra in Kannada, maybe 12th century CE. Munachara is important because it provides an all-encompassing account of monastic conduct from the primary vows to monastic discipline and so on and so forth. And it also acts as the source of authority for the medieval Digambara monastic law book, something which I will depict or show in very briefly soon. Now, coming to medieval Digambara monasticism, what was happening in post 10th century Digambara monastic groups? First thing is the rise of a new textual archive on monastic jurisprudence post 10th century CE, which was after a lacuna. There is a lacuna because the early monastic law books were all composed in 2nd to 3rd century CE. So we have at least 5, 6, or 7 centuries where we do not have any monastic law book. And then we have the production of these new monastic law books starting from 10th century CE. So why does this happen? I do not have a solid answer to this question. We're trying to look at different historical contexts to understand that why there was such a big gap between the production of monastic law books and how or why did it start after 10th century CE. Another very important phenomena is the shift from Prakrit to Sanskrit. Both the Mulachara and Bhagavati Aradhana were composed in Prakrit, but all these new monastic law books were composed in Sanskrit. Mulachara also gets its commentaries in this period. So we within the shift from Prakrit to Sanskrit, we have a sub feature of Prakrit text getting Sanskrit commentaries. Mulachara gets Acharvritti, Bhagavati Aradhana gets the Mularadhana Darpana of Ashadhara. So this is a common process. This is also the time period, and very importantly, of rise of new monastic lineages. Mula Sangha and Kasha Sangha were the two major Digambara groups in this time period, and Sen Gana and Balatkar Gana were the two major lineages within the Mula Sangha. And the latter arose post 10th century CE. Balatkar Gana arose in prominence post 10th century CE, and it can be somehow co-related to the production of monastic law books as well. All right, so let me first briefly mention the textual corpus I am looking at when I mean medieval Digambara monastic law books. So the production of monastic jurisprudence starts with the Charitra Sara of Chamunraya, composed in 11th century CE Deccan, followed by the Achara Sara of Viranandi, composed in 12th century CE Deccan, Karnataka. We then notice a shift. There is a shift from south to north, where we have the Anaga Dharmamrita of Ashadhara in Madhya Pradesh, composed in 13th century CE, in Malwa in particular. And then finally, we have the Mulachara Pradeepa of Sakala Kirti of the Bhattaraka, composed in 15th century CE, Rajasthan. Yes, some historical questions which I look at. We have already discussed the specific time period. It is also important to notice what were the socio-cultural changes that necessitated the production of new monastic law books, a shift from Prakrit to Sanskrit. We have discussed this earlier. Uh, Another very important phenomena is the rise of non-monk authors. Chamunraya and Ashadhara were householders and not monks. So what was exactly happening in Digambara society, which gave authority to Shravakas or to Grihasthas to not only compose monastic law books but to prescribe certain things for the monks. Regional divide is another very important factor because the first two law books were composed in the Deccan and the next two in western central India. Yeah, for the first law book is the Charitasar of Chamunraya, which is interesting because it poses so many questions to us without giving clear answers. For example, it includes both the Shravakachara and Yatyachara in its structure. So the first two chapters are basically Shravakachara, and from chapter 3 we start with Yatyachara of monastic conduct. So there's a trend of um, you know bringing together both Shravakachara and Yatyachara together in a single textual sphere. It is followed by the Acharasara of Veernandi, who was in 12th century CE Deccan. The interesting thing about the Acharasara is that it is completely based on the Mulachara. The textual structure is completely uh, uh, it can be considered to be an imitation of the Mulachara, but Veernandi makes some textual intervention and restructures the chapters of the Mulachara. So, for example, he omits some chapters. He omits chapters on Sanlekhana. He omits chapter on Pindushuddhi and includes Pindushuddhi within a different chapter, and he breaks away the chapter on Panchachara into five. So maybe, and this is very interesting because the idea of Panchachara is Samyak Gyan, Samyak Darshan, Samyak Charitra, Samyak Tap, Samyak Virya, or Viryachar, Tapachar, Gyanachar. It is not found prominently in Digambara Jainism. So why did Veerandi use the category of uh, Panchachara when it was not in vogue within Digambara societies? It is difficult for me to understand, and maybe it's about how different authors were presenting different ideologies, their own visions of monastic conduct, in using primary text and sort of engaging in a debate or dialogues with their contemporary authors. Yes, now then we have a shift from south to north, where we see the Anagar Dharmamrita of Ashadhara. Ashadhara can be considered as the single most influential author in medieval Digambar Jainism, who was a laity. Again, he was a member of the laity. He was a lay person. He was never a monk, but his textual influence, his scholarly influence was far-reaching. He authored a total of 20 texts, out of which 13 are available today. His monastic law book, the Anagar Dharmamrita, is a part of a wider thesis of a wider text called Dharmamrita, which includes two parts. The second part is the Sagar Dharmamrita, which describes the dharma of the laity. So we see the same textual trend of bringing together both the Shravakachara and the Yatyachara in the same place. And what Chamundraya does on a very small scale in a very brief text, Ashadhara makes it into a wide scale textual project. There are two auto commentaries named Bhavya Kubal Chandrika and Jnana Deepika, and yeah, Ashadhara is very important to understand the socio-religious context happening in medieval Digambar Jainism, because he includes what I call a new normative. And by new normative, I mean codifying certain monastic rituals and practices which were prevalent in his contemporary society but which were not included within the formal textual monastic jurisprudence before Ashadhara. So that is a new normative. He also defends the old normative by criticizing certain practices and providing their alternative. So, for example, Ashadhara condemns the practice of worshipping Shasana Devtas because he considers it to be impure, and exhorts both the monastic groups and the laity to not worship Shasana Devtas. So, in a way, in my research until now, Ashadhara Anagar Dharmavarta is, I think, the most extensive and the most successful law book in codifying contemporary monastic practices and including them into a formal monastic jurisprudence. The fourth law book is the Mulachara Pradeep of Sakalakirti, and although I have not been able to research much about the Mulachara Pradeepa, so I won't be presenting on it, but a few observations which I was able to make was firstly its very visible and obvious engagement with the Mulachara. The name itself, Mulachara Pradeepa, appears as if the author wants to convey that he is explaining the Mulachara, although it's a separate individual treatise. And at various places within the text, Sakalakirti invokes Mulachara. He explicitly says that he's using the Mulachara as its source. The textual structure is based on the Mulachara with 12 chapters in the text, although the Mulachara Pradeepa is the most extensive monastic law book. It has more than 3,000 verses, almost thrice what Mulachara is, what Mulachara has. And it will be interesting to see how Sakal Kirti as a Bhattaraka, as a monastic leader himself, deals with monastic conduct. And does he depict any social change, or does he want to project a continuity, which might be the case, and I'm not sure about it. So yeah, this is a very brief overview of the textual corpus I'm working on. And although my presentation was very brief, uh, two important points which I would like to make here is first the constant change and dynamic nature of Digambara monasticism and Digambara Jainism, which usually is considered to be a monolithic, constant, a static tradition. It's not static. It's not monolithic. This is, I think, John Coate mentioned this in one of his papers that Digambara Jainism is often considered as one big group, rather than taking into account the various regional cultures which were in play. And I think if we look at the production of these monastic law books, we precisely see the prevalence of different regional cultures. Second point is the importance of monastic laws to understand how society sees itself, because these monastic laws were not just concerned with the changing meaning of renunciation or the changing meaning of monasticism. It was about a self construction of identity. So ultimately, monastic laws and the reproduction of monastic laws relates with the community and identity formation in medieval Digambara communities, and how monasticism played an important role in it. So yeah, that's it from my end. I would stop here, and I would once again thank the Bhagwan Sheetalnath Chair in Jain Archaeology, especially uh, Professor Ganveer and my friend Ocean for inviting me. And thank you very much for this opportunity. I hope I made some sense. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kshitij, for sharing your presently ongoing research, and we wish you the best at Oxford University for your doctoral research also. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ocean. All the best.